So my brother Bruno was born different. His legs were turned inward, his vocal cords paralyzed. He was born with Klinefelter syndrome. It's a condition that includes severe cognitive developmental delays. And it took him 7 years, lots of surgeries, physical and speech therapy before he was able to walk or talk. I grew up watching Bruno put in 10 times more effort than I to achieve at most half of what I could. I remember one morning when I was 5 or 6 years old, in swimming class, watching him in the water, wondering how much longer it would take for him to float while I was already able to do laps. Growing up in Brazil, I watched my family try to navigate a school system that was never designed to accommodate his needs nor to foster his potential. I remember how many times the school would call my mom to pick him up in the middle of the afternoon because his behavior was disrupting the classroom. Bruno's experience growing up was not unique. Kids with disabilities in schools in Brazil receive additional resources to help them accommodate their specific needs, but their experiences continue to be subpar. Schools aspire to integrate, but it is often to the benefit of the typical kids and at the expense of the atypical ones. I remember feeling incredibly frustrated by how schools only focus on his deficits but not his assets, his powerful memory, how focused he was while painting, his passion for music, right? The school always thought that tending to the atypical ways through which he expressed his aspirations and needs was not their problem. It was either show up school ready or get out. Eventually, my mom decided to move my brother to a specialized school. But even in the regular school which I attended, many kids continued to struggle. I remember this kid who was always running around, distracted by something else. The teachers were so annoyed. He was a regular at the principal's office. But I knew this kid was sharp. We worked on several assignments together and he was always on point. But, he was always distracted by the next thing and flunked many assessments because he was focused on something else. It was a very competitive school. They tracked kids by GPA and the teachers handed the assignments back, in front of everyone else. So it was very clear to everyone that nobody thought this kid was the sharpest tool in the shed. And that surprised me that this could happen even to a kid who did not look the part. Researchers call all these conditions in the spectrum of learning differences, autism, dyslexia, attention deficit disorders, invisible disabilities, in the sense that, for many of these kids, just like for my brother, their deficits are very apparent while their potential might continue to be misrepresented or misunderstood. And this idea of invisibility sat with me because of something else, but also deeply personal. Many mornings when my wife Ellie wakes up, she calls for my help to find her glasses. When she has her glasses on, she's perfectly capable, but without her glasses, she's basically blind. And then one morning when I'm handing her her glasses, I'm wondering, could it be that also in schools there are kids who cannot see without glasses, but maybe nobody knows? That maybe cannot hear or cannot carry a pencil or a pen, but people are unaware. If they exist in the absence of a medical report, these functional disabilities and the students behind these experiences are also invisible. And it struck me that invisibility might lead to a double burden. First, these kids might not even get the resources, however imperfect, to support their specific needs in schools. But second, without being formally acknowledged, perhaps teachers and school staff will fill in the gaps, with wrong assumptions about what might be behind, for instance, reading below grade level. So this double burden likely leaves these invisible students behind. Well, I couldn't do much to, alleviate my brother's school experience growing up back in the day. Perhaps I could help these presumably millions of children still struggling in schools with invisible disabilities. But in order to do that, I first had to find them. So I'm in my office thinking, how could I find those kids? Where should I start? Perhaps, I guess, talking to the teachers and school staff. So I'm thinking, maybe it'd be nice to have at least 10 schools all over Brazil. Let's get started. So I go into those schools, and in every case, I ask the teachers, do kids like this exist in your schools? Kids who cannot see, cannot hear, cannot carry a pen or a pencil. And in each and every case, they say, yeah, these kids exist for sure, but I cannot note them in the system without a medical note. And I'm like, oh, that's a big problem. That's invisibility. And then in every case, after the bell rings, I'm talking to these teachers and I tell them a hypothetical story that goes something like this. Hobson is a 5th grader who's quite popular at school. Recently, he seems to be paying less attention to class. He moved to the first rows. He seems to be struggling copying what's on the board. As for his colleagues' help to take some of these notes, often complains of headaches after class, and his performance in reading and writing has been declining relative to his peers. And I asked, do you see kids like this in your school? And what do you do about that? And they say, sure, these kids are here. And I think they're going to tell me, we help these kids in such and such ways, but nope. They tell me that kids like Hobson are a product of broken families. In the words of one of these teachers, they are orphans of living mothers. Can you believe it? I'm shocked. The double burden was real. As much as I like to be right, this didn't really help me at all. I need to find these kids, right? And I'm thinking perhaps because of invisibility, I'm not going to be able to find them at all. Or at least not by talking to teachers and school staff. So I'm back in my office and I'm thinking, what should I try next? Perhaps talk to the students directly? It's embarrassing to admit, but we adults tend to think that when we ask kids, children and adolescents about their race, their gender, their disability status, they're not going to understand. Or perhaps not as well as we adults do. But the truth is, as I told you, asking adults has its own problems because we have our own biases. So let's hear these kids up. I'm in my office again, and I'm thinking, well, if I want really good numbers, precise figures about this problem, I better have a big sample. 250 schools all over the country. I should hear at least 3,000 kids. Let's hear them up. So I'm entering one of these schools back in São Paulo, the state where Bruno and I grew up. And it's a school that's very different from the one I attended growing up. The painting on the walls is cracked. I see a poster from the Ministry of Education about the importance of reading that's partially torn. In the school, I met a kid named Jonas. Jonas used to love school until he didn't. In the beginning of middle school, his grades in math and English started going down. And, his parents started saying that his C's were a cry for attention. His teacher started saying that maybe he was not cut out for college, and he was starting to believe them. You see, asking a kid like Jonas about learning disabilities will be hard, especially in the absence of a medical report. But asking him if he struggled to see what's on the board, even when sitting up close, if he struggled to listen to what a teacher says, even when the classroom is quiet, if he struggled carrying a pen or a pencil, is something we could do. So by asking kids like Jonas, 3,000 kids like him, I learned that at least 5% of Brazilian K-12 students really struggle to see. If I add up the hearing and motor challenges, at least 10% of Brazilian students have one of these functional disabilities that are so easily addressed if only the districts knew. Still with this number for a second. 1 out of every 10 students in Brazil are invisible. They're struck by that double burden. They don't receive the resources that they would need, and presumably they're stuck in this low aspirations trap as well. So I'm thinking, the data we collected didn't exist before, but I can only imagine it's always been like that. For middle-income countries like Brazil, maybe, that's just the way things are. Maybe they will never change. So a few months later, after we collected this data, Jonas finally took a vision test. Got the medical appointment he needed. And guess what? He couldn't make out the small letters in this poster. He got a prescription that was a -12 prescription. Can you believe it? God knows since when. Maybe since the beginning of middle school. Now that Jonas received eyeglasses, his performance in school, picked up again. He's interested, and he already sees, a college degree down the line in a few years. In a sense, Jonas' experiences is unique because at the same time as he got his corrective eyeglasses, millions of students, based on our figures, remain unattended in the schools, in Brazil and elsewhere. Even though it's so frustrating because these exams are cheap, corrective eyeglasses are relatively inexpensive relative to their impacts, but schools do not regularly run those tests, and parents are uninformed about the issue. So that's frustrating. But the truth is, Jonas' story doesn't have to be unique. Early last year, For a couple of months, a state senator from Sao Paulo visited Stanford. And while she was here, towards the end of her time, she learned about my study. So we sat together and talked about teachers' beliefs, student stories. And she said, when it was about time for her to go back, that she was not just going to see it with what she learned. A few weeks into being back in the office, she passed a bill that sponsored vision tests for 113,000 students back in Sao Paulo. And Jonas was one of them. In 2026, the district committed to testing the vision for all its 2.4 million students and to provide eyeglasses for those who need them. You see, my brother Bruno eventually grew up to not only walk with his reconstructed feet and ankles, but also to run, bike, and even roller skate. To not only talk with his diaphragm, imagine that, but even to yap and sing. He loves most Beatles songs, but he never learned how to read. You know, his disability, very visible, kept him trapped in this low expectations trap. You know, the burden of a visible disability. Jonas, unlike my brother, didn't have a permanent handicap that would prevent him from learning, but as long as his condition was invisible, he was also trapped in a low expectations trap. And you know, I imagined that just for my brother, that double burden would accompany him for his whole educational trajectory. But I was wrong. Sometimes, when the right data brings an addressable problem to light, things can change, and sometimes pretty quickly. So I think Jonas' story tells us that being seen is a necessary condition for fully participating in society. It might not be enough, but it is the beginning. Thank you.